Henry James published, 1898. Category, S. Fiction, Occult and Supernatural, Supernatural Creatures, Ghost about James, born on the 15th of April, 1843, in New York City. Henry James became one of his generation's most well-known writers and remains so to this day for such works as The Portrait of a Lady and The Turn of the Screw. Having lived in England for 40 years, James became a British subject in 1915, the year before his death. He died on the 28th of February, 1916, in London, England. Henry James, born the 15th of April, 1843, New York, New York, U.S. Died the 28th of February, 1916, London, England, American novelist and, as a naturalized English citizen from 1915, a great figure in the transatlantic culture. His fundamental theme was the innocence and exuberance of the New World in clash with the corruption and wisdom of the Old, as illustrated in such works as Daisy Miller, 1879, The Portrait of a Lady, 1881, The Bostonians, 1886, and The Ambassadors, 1903. Summary: an anonymous narrator recalls a Christmas Eve gathering at an old house, where guests listen to one another's ghost stories. A guest named Douglas introduces a story that involves two children, Flora and Miles, and his sister's governess, with whom he was in love. After procuring the governess's written record of events from his home, he provides a few introductory details. A handsome bachelor persuaded the governess to take a position as governess for his niece and nephew in an isolated country home after the previous governess died. Douglas begins to read from the written record, and the story shifts to the governess's point of view as she narrates her strange experience. The governess begins her story with her first day at BLY, the country home, where she meets Flora and a maid named Mrs. Gross. The governess is nervous but feels relieved by Flora's beauty and charm. The next day she receives a letter from her employer, which contains a letter from Miles's headmaster saying that Miles cannot return to school. The letter does not specify what Miles has done to deserve expulsion, and, alarmed, the governess questions Mrs. Gross about it. Mrs. Gross admits that Miles has on occasion been bad, but only in the ways boys ought to be. The governess is reassured as she drives to meet Miles. One evening, as the governess strolls around the grounds, she sees a strange man in a tower of the house and exchanges an intense stare with him. She says nothing to Mrs. Gross. Later, she catches the same man glaring into the dining room window, and she rushes outside to investigate. The man is gone, and the governess looks into the window from outside. Her image in the window frightens Mrs. Gross, who has just walked into the room. The governess discusses her two experiences with Mrs. Gross, who identifies the strange man as Peter Kint, a former valet who is now dead. Convinced that the ghost seeks Miles, the governess becomes rigid in her supervision of the children. One day, when the governess is at the lake with Flora, she sees a woman dressed in black and senses that the woman is Miss Jessel, her dead predecessor. The governess is certain Flora was aware of the ghost's presence but intentionally kept quiet. The governess again questions Mrs. Gross about Miles's misbehavior. Mrs. Gross reveals that Kint had been too free with Miles, and Miss Jessel with Flora. The governess is on her guard, but the days pass without incident, and Miles and Flora express increased affection for the governess. The lull is broken one evening when something startles the governess from her reading. She rises to investigate, moving to the landing above the staircase. There, a gust of wind extinguishes her candle, and she sees Kint halfway up the stairs. She refuses to back down, exchanging another intense stare with Kint until he vanishes. Back in her room, the governess finds Flora's bed curtains pulled forward, but Flora herself is missing. Noticing movement under the window blind, the governess watches as Flora emerges from behind it. The governess questions Flora about what she's been doing, but Flora's explanation is unrevealing. The governess does not sleep well during the next few nights. One night, she sees the ghost of Miss Jessel sitting on the bottom stair, her head in her hands. Later, when the governess finally allows herself to go to sleep at her regular hour, she is awoken after midnight to find her candle extinguished and Flora by the window. Careful not to disturb Flora, the governess leaves the room to find a window downstairs that overlooks the same view. Looking out, she sees the faraway figure of Miles on the lawn. Later, the governess discusses with Mrs. Gross her conversation with Miles, who claimed that he wanted to show the governess that he could be bad. The governess concludes that Flora and Miles frequently meet with Miss Jessel and Kint. At this, Mrs. Gross urges the governess to appeal to her employer, but the governess refuses, reminding her colleague that the children's uncle does not want to be bothered. She threatens to leave if Mrs. Gross writes to him. On the walk to church one Sunday, Miles broaches the topic of school to the governess. He says he wants to go back and declares he will make his uncle come to BLY. The governess, shaken, does not go into church. Instead, she returns to the house and plots her departure. She sits on the bottom stair but springs up when she remembers seeing Miss Jessel there. She enters the schoolroom and finds Miss Jessel sitting at the table. She screams at the ghost, and the ghost vanishes. The governess decides she will stay at BLY. Mrs. Gross and the children return, saying nothing about the governess's absence at church. The governess agrees to write to her employer. That evening, the governess listens outside Miles's door. He invites her in, and she questions him. She embraces him impulsively. The candle goes out, and Miles shrieks. The next day Miles plays the piano for the governess. She suddenly realizes she doesn't know where Flora is. She and Mrs. Gross find Flora by the lake. There, the governess sees an apparition of Miss Jessel. She points it out to Flora and Mrs. Gross, but both claim not to see it. Flora says that the governess is cruel and that she wants to get away from her, and the governess collapses on the ground in hysterics. The next day, Mrs. Gross informs the governess that Flora is sick. They decide Mrs. Gross will take Flora to the children's uncle while the governess stays at BLY with Miles. Mrs. Gross informs the governess that Luke didn't send the letter she wrote to her employer, because he couldn't find it. With Flora and Mrs. Gross gone, Miles and the governess talk after dinner. The governess asks if he took her letter. He confesses, and the governess sees Kint outside. She watches Kint in horror, then points him out to Miles, who asks if it is Peter Kint and looks out the window in vain. He cries out, then falls into the governess's arms, dead. Critical analysis. Henry James's novella, The Turn of the Screw, has been referred to by scholars as the author's most puzzling and controversial work. Curtis N.P. Literary critic Harold Bloom has described James's oeuvre as being marked with great intelligence and energy, with a moral innocence that confirmed his ripe unconsciousness of evil, one of the most beautiful signs by which we know him. For in James's work, wrote Bloom, the reader gets the sense that the writer drew inspiration for his characters and their mild troubles from a turn-of-the-century community, in which misery and extravagance, and either extreme of any sort, were equally absent. For yet Turn of the Screw, a work from the latter part of James's writing career and his life, does not fit comfortably or neatly within such an admiring and benevolent description. Turn of the Screw is curious precisely because compared to other works by Henry James, the author exhibits a ripe consciousness of evil and of profound psychological disturbance. using the genre of the ghost story, credited as originating with M.R. James, a contemporary of Henry James. The author skillfully provokes the reader's anxieties by evoking the psychological mechanisms of the horror of the unknown. The effect, as is always the case with a well-crafted ghost story or something in a similar genre, is that existential questions rise to the surface of the reader's consciousness, allowing the reader of turn of the screw and the writer to enter into a dialogue about real life through the medium of seemingly fantastic events. For all of the skill he demonstrates in writing the ghost story Turn of the Screw, his first and only experiment with the ghost story genre, James also simultaneously subverts the narrative form of this genre, creating still another level of psychological suspense in Turn of the Screw and a level of narrator-related sophistication. Both his use of the ghost story form and genre and his subversion of it will be explored in this article. On the surface, Turn of the Screw by Henry James has all the makings of a good old-fashioned ghost story, adhering closely to the conventions of this genre as they were established by their progenitor, M.R. James, Coxswain. M.R. James is reputed as having been the originator of the ghost story as a genre, publishing his first story of this type in 1880, Cox 13. Nearly 20 years before the serial format publication of Henry James's Turn of the Screw, Curtis 7. According to Cox, M.R. James established the basic conceptual and narrative framework to which all subsequent ghost stories have conformed. Cox explains the formula by saying that the ghost story is an unlooked-for revelation of an alien order of things, a wholly malevolent beyond, linked to our world by a perplexing and dangerous logic, a logic which is activated by a chance word, an unthinking action, curiosity, or simply being in the wrong place at the right time. Coxswain. The notion of the wholly malevolent beyond provides a thematic framework both for the genre of Turn of the Screw by Henry James and continuity that is matched by a consistent, almost formulaic technical approach. Coxswain. Cox, citing Collins, explains the basic trajectory of the ghost story formula in the following manner. The reader of Turn of the Screw by Henry James is introduced to the actors in a placid way, going about their ordinary business, undisturbed by forebodings, pleased with their surroundings. Then, gradually, one safeguard after another is removed, leaving both the characters we have come to like and ourselves, the readers, exposed and vulnerable. Coxswain. Eventually, all barriers between safety and threat collapse entirely, as into this calm environment, the ominous thing puts out its head, unobtrusively at first, and then more insistently, until it holds the stage. Coxswain. Cox insists that the development of the characters is secondary in importance to the provocation of palpable fear. In fact, the best characterization is likely to be of the ghost, which is a figure that represents a natural source of revulsion and causes horror, stimulating the reader's primal fears and anxieties, which have been largely unconscious to him or her until the encounter with the text. Coxswain. As Cox observes, atmosphere and incident are more important, for the reader needs to feel that there is nothing peculiar to the protagonists that singles them out for supernatural violation.